If you're a 40K lore nut, you already know the Emperor denied being a god. You've heard it a dozen times from a dozen different YouTubers, read it on 100 wiki pages, absorbed it through pure osmosis from codex supplements and Reddit threads. He rejected worship. He enforced secularism. He called himself a man, not a deity. It's the first thing anyone tells you about the setting, usually within 45 seconds of starting to explain it. But the part almost nobody unpacks, the part everyone states once and then blows right past, is how a being who spent much of his long existence fighting superstition wound up as the rotting, suffering centerpiece of the largest theocracy the galaxy has ever produced. Trillions worship him across 1,000,000 worlds. Psykers are consumed continuously to keep the Throne and Astronomican system functioning, with about 1,000 a day often cited but contested, on a machine that was never built to hold him. An entire priesthood he would have personally dismantled governed civilization in his name, chanting prayers he'd find revolting, enforcing superstitions he spent centuries eradicating. Whether you've been painting miniatures since 2nd edition, or you showed up because Henry Cavill won't stop evangelizing this universe to anyone with a camera pointed at him, the central tragedy of Warhammer 40,000 runs through the same vein. The Emperor spent much of his long existence fighting superstition. His reward was becoming exactly what he despised, a god on a throne of suffering. Not because chaos won outright, but because his own sons corrupted his vision from within. The civilization his servants built in his name became the thing he would have burned to the ground. That paradox crystallized over 10,000 years, but its roots reach back to a doctrine called the Imperial truth, the state ideology the Emperor enforced during the Great Crusade. The Great Crusade itself lasted roughly 200 standard years, beginning when the nascent Imperium launched from Terra to reunify thousands of scattered human colonies spread across the galaxy after millennia of isolation, civil war, and technological collapse. The Emperor led this campaign personally at first, commanding fleets and armies alongside his 20 genetically engineered sons, the Primarchs, and their legions of transhuman warriors. During that expansion, he didn't just conquer territory, he imposed a philosophy. The Imperial truth was enforced atheism backed by the most powerful military machine humanity had ever assembled. Its core premise was non-negotiable. There are no gods, no divine forces, no spirits worthy of veneration. The Emperor held that religion and superstition had divided mankind too deeply throughout its history. Every war launched under a deity's banner, every civilization strangled by priestly authority, every century wasted in ritualized ignorance, all of it functioned as evidence in the Emperor's framework that faith was humanity's oldest and most dangerous weakness. His solution wasn't tolerance or gradual reform, it was eradication. Scientists, engineers, and secular thinkers became the cultural backbone of the expanding Imperium. The Imperial truth lent the Emperor's symbolic support to every skeptic, every rationalist, every researcher whose work the species' survival depended on. Temples were demolished, not mothballed, not repurposed, demolished. Preachers were silenced or removed entirely from positions of cultural influence. Worlds that worshipped local deities were brought to compliance, and compliance in Great Crusade terminology didn't mean a polite request backed by economic incentives. It meant legions, if necessary. Cultures rooted in superstition were re-educated under military occupation or conquered outright. On most worlds, the process involved both. The Emperor's position in the strongest recurring sources is unambiguous. He denied his divinity outright. More than that, lore tied to the master of mankind presents superstition and ignorance as things that attract the warp's denizens. In his framework, religion wasn't merely incorrect. It was tangled up with humanity's vulnerability to the psychic predators lurking in the dimension that bordered real space. Faith wasn't just foolishness, it was danger. And the Emperor didn't limit this campaign to alien religions or fringe cults clinging to existence on backwater colonies at the galaxy's edge. On Terra itself, humanity's homeworld, the seat of the Emperor's power, the physical and symbolic capital of everything he was building, He went after the very last church still standing. The story of Uriah Olather, the priest who maintained that final church, survives in the lore through the Horus Heresy short story, The Last Church, as one of the clearest windows into the emperor's anti-theistic philosophy. The emperor didn't dispatch a military detachment or issue a bureaucratic closure notice. He walked through the door himself. A being of incalculable psychic power, the architect of a galactic empire, sat down with one aging priest in a cold stone building and debated him face to face. The setting was intimate. Two people in a dying room, the smell of candle wax and dust, arguing about religion, history, and what humanity should become. Olather pushed back. He argued that faith provided meaning, that it sustained people through suffering, that the emperor's rationalism was cold and inhuman. The emperor didn't concede. The church didn't survive the night. That exchange, an immortal conqueror personally arguing an elderly priest out of his faith before the last religious building on earth closes forever, captures the scale of the emperor's commitment. This wasn't background policy. This was a crusade as total as the military one, waged with equal conviction against the interior architecture of human belief. For 200 years of the Great Crusade, the most powerful civilization in galactic history operated without a state religion and actively criminalized the concept. Thousands of worlds were brought into the Imperium under the Imperial Truth's banner. Entire cultures abandoned millennia-old faiths because the alternative was annihilation by transhuman soldiers who didn't negotiate on points of theology. But the Imperial Truth had a structural flaw baked into its foundation, and at least one of the Emperor's own generals saw it clearly before the collapse arrived. Jagatai Khan, Primarch of the White Scars, one of the Emperor's 20 sons, warned Malkador the Sigillite, the Emperor's closest advisor, that the deception at the heart of the Imperial Truth couldn't hold. Khan's argument, as preserved in the lore, cut to the fatal weakness. The Emperor was telling an entire civilization that the warp's entities didn't exist, while simultaneously building the most ambitious psychic engineering project in human history. The Imperial Truth denied the reality of chaos. The warp was real. The things inside it, things any pre-imperial culture would have called gods or demons, were real. Telling billions of humans these forces were myth and superstition, while the Emperor himself spent every waking hour fighting them in secret, was a contradiction with an expiration date. Khan warned Malkador that when the blindfold slipped, and it would slip, the fury of those who'd been deceived would be limitless. The Emperor chose suppression over education. He told humanity the monsters weren't real, then went downstairs to fight them alone. When the truth finally broke through, the backlash wasn't skeptical, it was religious. And the secret project that consumed the Emperor's attention, the one he was hiding from his own empire, was the single thing that could have made the whole gamble worthwhile. The Golden Throne, arguably the most iconic object in Warhammer 40,000, wasn't built as a life support machine. That's what it became. It was created to control access to the Imperial Webway, a human-engineered extension of the ancient Eldari Webway network, built in a vast construction space deep beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra. The Webway is a system of tunnels running through an alternative dimension, corridors that allow instantaneous travel between distant points in the galaxy without ever entering the warp. No warp exposure means no chaos corruption, no dependence on Psyker navigators steering ships through a hell dimension, no vulnerability to the predatory entities the Emperor was spending his entire strategic existence pretending didn't exist. If the Webway project succeeded, humanity could travel and communicate across interstellar distances without touching the dimension that housed its worst enemies. Trade, military deployment, colonization, communication, all of it running through clean, chaos-free tunnels rather than the screaming psychic nightmare that had been eating ships and corrupting populations for millennia. The Emperor could have delivered on the Imperial Truth's promise in a way that actually mattered, not by suppressing knowledge of the warp forever, but by engineering a future where the warp was strategically irrelevant to daily human life. The lie wouldn't need to hold if the threat it concealed no longer mattered. The Webway was the endgame. The Great Crusade, the Primarchs, the legions, that was scaffolding. The point was the tunnels beneath the palace. The Emperor worked on the project personally, and it consumed him so completely that he withdrew from frontline command of the Great Crusade. He handed supreme military authority to a war master, his most trusted Primarch, Horus Lupercal, and retreated to Terra. The armies that had watched their emperor lead charges across alien worlds now received orders relayed through intermediaries. Worlds were conquered in his name by sons who hadn't seen him in decades. He was building something that demanded his full psychic attention, and he gave it exactly that, trusting that his sons could carry the crusade without him. 20 Primarchs in total, 20 genetically engineered sons, each designed to lead a legion of transhuman warriors and carry the Imperium's expansion across the galaxy. Conquerors, administrators, generals, icons. This is the franchise where fans joke they'd rather be caught watching something deeply inappropriate than try to explain the family tree to someone who just walked into the room. 20 sons, 20 legions, a galaxy-spanning civil war, and a 10,000-year aftermath. Once you start explaining what those sons did to their father, you understand the impulse to minimize your browser instead. Because the Primarch project, in one form or another, became an instrument of the Emperor's destruction. 3 of them illustrate the pattern at its most devastating. Lorgar Aurelian, devotion turned heresy. Magnus the Red, love turned catastrophe. Horus Lupercal, trust turned betrayal. Lorgar first. Because the irony with Lorgar is so structurally perfect, it reads like tragedy written by a vengeful author. Lorgar Aurelian, Primarch of the 17th Legion, the Word-Bearers, loved his father with a devotion that crossed every line the Emperor had drawn. While other Primarchs conquered worlds through martial prowess or strategic brilliance, Lorgar conquered through conversion. He didn't just bring planets into the Imperium's political structure, he raised cathedrals on them. He built temples with soaring arches and golden imagery. He composed sacred texts glorifying the Emperor as a divine being, worthy of genuine worship, demanding genuine faith. The populations Lorgar brought to compliance didn't just accept Imperial law, they prayed. They lit candles in alcoves carved with the Emperor's face. They knelt before golden aquillas on marble floors and wept with gratitude for the God Emperor's protection. On every world Lorgar touched, you could hear the hymns from orbit. Metaphorically, and in some descriptions of his conquests, almost literally. Lorgar believed, with total sincerity, that the Emperor was divine, not metaphorically, not as a useful symbol of human aspiration, literally, cosmically divine, a being whose power could only be explained as godhood and whose magnificence demanded worship as naturally as a star demands orbits. In one confrontation preserved in the lore, Lorgar called the Emperor a god to his face and told him to stop denying it. The Emperor's response was calm, immovable, and devastating in its restraint. He told Lorgar he was blind. Divinity was the one title the Emperor wouldn't accept, and Lorgar was the one son who'd never stop offering it. For decades, this created an agonizing tension within the Great Crusade. The Word-Bearers were the slowest expanding legion, not because they couldn't fight, but because Lorgar poured enormous time and energy into constructing religious infrastructure on every conquered world. His campaign progress embarrassed the rest of the war effort. Other legions took worlds in weeks and moved on. Lorgar took them in months, then stayed for months more, building shrines, training priests, writing liturgy, painting murals of the Emperor's radiance on freshly plastered walls. Every world he touched became a temple world. Every population he pacified became a congregation. On the cathedral world of Kur, Lorgar built what he considered his masterwork, the city of Monarchia. Built from the ground up as a monument to the Emperor's supposed divinity, Monarchia was a perfect city in the sense that Lorgar understood perfection. Every street radiated devotion. Archways bore inscriptions praising the Emperor's grace. Every building functioned as a hymn rendered in stone, steel, and colored glass. The light through the windows designed to fall in patterns that evoke the emperor's radiance at specific hours of the day. Lorgar poured years into it. He considered Monarchia the purest expression of his love for his father, proof that worship could elevate civilization rather than poison it, proof that the emperor was wrong about faith, proof that devotion could build something beautiful enough to change his father's mind. The emperor ordered it destroyed. He didn't send a diplomatic envoy. He didn't write a letter. He sent another legion, the Ultramarines, under Roboute Guilliman, to raise Monarchia to its foundations while the word-bearers watched. Guilliman's warriors moved through the city systematically. The cathedral spires came down first, crashing into streets designed to channel worshippers toward their doors. The stained glass shattered. The murals burned. The inscriptions cracked and fell as walls collapsed under orbital bombardment and bolter fire. Lorgar's masterpiece burned in front of him. The work of years, the physical form of his deepest conviction, reduced to rubble and drifting ash while his sons, his warriors, his believers, stood at forced attention and watched it happen. Then the emperor went further. He forced Lorgar and the entire Word-Bearers Legion to kneel in those ashes. Not in a private room, not through an intermediary's message. In person, on their knees, armor grinding into the debris of everything they'd built, while the emperor stood above them and made his position unmistakable. Stop building temples. Stop writing prayers. You won't worship me. This is what happens to worship offered in my name. Monarchia was meant to cure Lorgar of his need to worship. It cured nothing. What it destroyed was Lorgar's belief that the emperor deserved his devotion. Lorgar didn't abandon the impulse. He abandoned its object. The need for a god to serve, a real, responsive, reciprocating god who would welcome what was offered rather than grind it under his heel, survived Monarchia intact. What changed was the direction it pointed. Lorgar went searching for beings that would accept what his father had rejected. He found them in the warp. The chaos gods, the exact entities the imperial truth denied existed, the exact entities the emperor feared above all else. Lorgar became one of the first primarchs to embrace chaos. His turn helped catalyze the Horus Heresy, the galaxy-spanning civil war that would ultimately shatter everything. But the deepest wound Lorgar inflicted on his father's legacy had already been delivered before any of that. Before Monarchia, before chaos, before the heresy. While Lorgar was still nominally loyal, still operating within the Imperium structure, still worshipping the Emperor with every breath, he had already written one of the most consequential religious texts in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting, the Lectitio Divinitatis, a theological text affirming the Emperor's divinity, composed during the Great Crusade by the very Primarch the Emperor would publicly humiliate for that belief. Imperial scholars within the setting identify the Lectitio Divinitatis as a foundational precursor to the Temple of the Savior Emperor, which itself became the basis of the imperial cult, the state religion of the 41st millennium Imperium, the ecclesiarchy, the priesthood, the theocratic infrastructure governing 1,000,000 worlds in the name of a god who explicitly and violently told them to stop. All of it traces back to Lorgar's book. The founding scripture of the religion the emperor despised most was written by his own son. The son he humiliated for worship authored the Bible, and that Bible survived the heresy, survived the millennia, survived every political and institutional upheaval of the next 10,000 years, and became the organizing text of a galactic theocracy built on the precise inversion of everything the emperor spent his existence trying to destroy. Lorgar didn't shatter his father's vision with a sword. He shattered it with devotion, rejected, redirected, and transmuted into the ideological foundation of the emperor's eternal prison. A son's love, spurned and left to curdle, became the doctrine an entire species would use to worship a god against his will for 100 centuries. As described in the lore from his book, Lorgar himself eventually reflected that all he ever wanted was the truth. The Emperor denied him that. What Lorgar found instead, in the warp, was worse than a lie. It was an answer. Lorgar corrupted the dream. Magnus the Red destroyed the exit. Magnus, Primarch of the 15th Legion, the Thousand Sons, was the Emperor's most psychically gifted child. His abilities were immense, his intellect matched them, and the lore strongly implies he was intended to play a central role in the Webway project. A son whose extraordinary psychic capacity could eventually help manage the transit network that would free humanity from the warp. Of all 20 Primarchs, Magnus had the deepest connection to what the Emperor was actually building beneath the Imperial Palace, and arguably the strongest personal stake in seeing it succeed. When Horus turned traitor and began marshaling legions for civil war, Magnus learned of the betrayal through his own psychic abilities. Across the galaxy from Terra, he faced a desperate choice. Normal communication, astropathic messages relayed through chains of Psykers, would take too long. The Imperium could fall before word reached the Emperor. So Magnus did the one thing his father had explicitly forbidden. He used sorcery to project a psychic warning directly across the galaxy, punching through the warp itself to reach Terra. Picture it. A Primarch of extraordinary power, alone on the world of Prospero, gathering every scrap of psychic force he possessed and hurling it across light years of screaming warp space toward his father. His intent was desperately loyal. Save the Imperium. Warn the Emperor. Stop the heresy before it gained unstoppable momentum. His effect was catastrophic beyond anything he could have predicted. Magnus's psychic message didn't just reach Terra. It shattered the protective wards surrounding the Imperial Webway, the painstakingly constructed barriers that kept the warp from flooding into the tunnel system. The breach was immediate and total. The tunnels that were supposed to carry humanity's future became a highway for demons. Entities poured through the gap directly into the construction space beneath the Imperial Palace. The Emperor's own project, the work of decades, breached from the inside by the son most suited to understanding what it was. The war within the Webway raged for approximately a decade during the heresy, dated in Lexicanum to 004 through 014.M31. 10 years of constant warfare in the corridors of humanity's greatest engineering project. Defenders fighting a grinding retreat against an endless tide of demons flooding through the wound Magnus had torn. The Emperor was forced to abandon everything else: the Great Crusade, the war against Horus, his freedom to act anywhere in the galaxy, to sit on the Golden Throne and hold the breach sealed through sheer psychic will. The device built to control the Webway's access points became a psychic plug jammed into a warp-sized hole. If the Emperor stood up for even a moment, the breach would widen. Terra itself would be consumed from below. Demons would pour through the Imperial Palace and into the heart of humanity's civilization. After 10 years, Imperial forces retreated from the Webway entirely. The tunnels were lost. The portal was permanently sealed. The project was dead. The Emperor's endgame, the transit network that would have freed humanity from the warp, the entire strategic justification for the crusade, the secret that gave the Imperial truth a future, was gone because one loyal son tried to deliver a warning and shattered the lock on the door in the process. A device built to control humanity's passage through clean corridors became the device that chained its creator to a warp rift beneath his own palace. Magnus didn't rebel. He tried to help. Out of genuine love and desperate urgency, he accidentally destroyed the only thing that could have made the Imperial truth more than a comforting lie. One catastrophic miscalculation at the worst possible moment by the one son uniquely designed to know better. A different species of tragedy from Lorgar's corrupted devotion, less poetic, more mechanically devastating. And while the Emperor sat locked on the throne, holding the Webway breach sealed, Unable to move, unable to intervene anywhere in the galaxy, his war master was tearing the Imperium apart above him. Horus Lupercal, the Primarch the Emperor had trusted enough to hand supreme military command of the entire Great Crusade, turned traitor. Corrupted by the Chaos Gods through a combination of manipulation, psychic assault, and exploitation of Horus's own resentments, the War Master launched a civil war that split the Imperium down the middle. 9 legions stayed loyal. 9 followed Horus into rebellion. The Horus heresy tore across thousands of worlds, killed billions, and, as official Warhammer community material describes it, forever reshaped the galaxy and built the brutal horror of the Imperium of Man that endures in the 41st millennium. The full story of Horus's fall fills dozens of novels. The essential fact is simpler. The Emperor's chosen successor became his executioner. At the climax of the heresy, Horus brought his armada to Terra itself. The siege of Terra was grinding and apocalyptic, an all-out assault on the Imperial palace that threatened to destroy the Imperium at its source. Orbital bombardment hammered the palace's void shields. Traitor legions poured through breaches and walls that had stood for centuries. Demons manifested in the corridors. The defenders were dying faster than they could be reinforced. When the fortifications teetered on the edge of final collapse, the Emperor teleported aboard Horus's flagship for a direct confrontation with his favorite son. What happened on that ship ended the heresy and the Emperor's physical existence in the same stroke. Horus was destroyed. The Emperor was mortally wounded, his body shattered beyond any possibility of conventional healing, ruined so completely that no biological process or medical technology available to the 31st Millennium Imperium could restore him. What remained of the Emperor, broken, failing, still psychically incandescent but physically annihilated, was carried back to Terra by his surviving loyalists. They placed him on the Golden Throne, the throne that was built for the Webway, the throne Magnus had turned into a warp breach plug, the throne that now had to simultaneously sustain its occupant's ruined body, hold the rift beneath Terra sealed against an ocean of demons, and power the Astronomican, the psychic navigation beacon that every ship in the Imperium depends on to traverse the warp without becoming lost in it. 3 functions, none optional, all demanding that the throne's occupant endure without ceasing and without relief. 3 suns, 3 different paths to the same destination. Horus struck the blow that put the Emperor on the throne. Magnus shattered the project that would have kept him off it. Lorgar wrote the scripture for the religion that would worship him on it for the next 10,000 years. For more than 100 centuries, the Emperor has sat immobile on the golden throne of Earth. That sentence opens the standard Warhammer 40,000 introduction, and every word earns its weight. 100 centuries, 10,000 years. Immobile, present tense, because he hasn't moved since the day after Horus fell. Canonical descriptions of his physical state are blunt enough to function as horror writing. He's described as a rotting carcass writhing invisibly with power from the dark age of technology. That phrasing, carcass, appears in the setting's own introductory text. Not body, not vessel, not remains. The word chosen is the word you'd use for a dead animal. He's been decomposing on the throne for 10 millennia and continues to decompose. Ancient machinery from a technological era so advanced the 41st Millennium Imperium can barely maintain the devices, let alone comprehend them, cycles his organs and sustains a biological scaffolding that should have turned to dust 8,000 years ago. His flesh has rotted away from bone in places. His eyes don't open. He doesn't speak in words anyone standing in the throne room can hear. What remains is sinew, skeletal structure, the barest tissue envelope needed to anchor a psychic presence powerful enough to light up half the galaxy. But his mind, according to the lore, remains fully active in the warp. The Emperor's psychic output anchors the Astronomican, the navigational beacon that makes faster-than-light warp travel possible for every vessel in the Imperium. Without the Astronomican, navigators, the mutant human Psykers who steer ships through the warp, lose their reference point. Ships become lost in a dimension where time, space, and physics don't behave predictably. Supply lines collapse, Military reinforcements never arrive. Astropathic communication, the Imperium's only method of faster-than-light messaging, relayed through chains of Psykers, depends on infrastructure that ultimately traces back to the throne's occupant. Remove the Emperor, and the million-world Imperium fragments overnight into isolated pockets of humanity with no way to reach, speak to, or reinforce one another. The throne also holds the Webway breach sealed. The rift Magnus tore open 10,000 years ago still exists beneath the Imperial palace, held shut by the Emperor's psychic force alone. If the throne fails, or its occupant dies, that breach reopens. Demons flood Terra. The capital of the Imperium becomes a warp gate. Life support, navigation beacon, warp breach containment. 3 critical functions running simultaneously through one ancient failing machine and one decaying body. Nobody designed this system. Nobody chose it. It emerged from cascading disasters. Magnus's mistake, Horus's betrayal, the Emperor's mortal wounding. Improvised into a permanent arrangement because every alternative meant immediate species-level extinction. And keeping the prisoner functional requires fuel that would have revolted the man who sits on that chair. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica, the imperial institution responsible for managing humanity's psychic population, oversees key parts of that pipeline, including the Black Ships network that gathers Psykers across the Imperium. Their purpose is straightforward and horrifying. They travel the galaxy in perpetual circuits, visiting world after world, screening populations for psychically gifted humans, and taking them. Every inhabited world in the Imperium is obligated to surrender its Psykers. Planetary authorities identify them through testing, through monitoring, through the violent and often public manifestation of uncontrolled psychic powers. Objects moving without being touched, voices heard in empty rooms, fires starting in someone's wake, or worse, much worse. The things that happen when a Psyker's untrained mind accidentally touches the warp and something touches back. The identified Psykers are gathered, held in containment facilities, and handed over when the Black Ships arrive in orbit. The ships collect the human cargo and move on to the next world, the next system, the next sector. Across 1 million inhabited planets, this process runs continuously, year after year, century after century. 10,000 years of harvest without a single interruption. What happens when the Psykers reach Terra depends on assessment. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica and the Scholastica Psychana evaluate each arrival by strength, mental stability, and potential utility. A small fraction, the most powerful, the most mentally resilient, the ones who can endure what comes next, are subjected to a process called soul binding. During soul binding, a portion of the Emperor's own psychic will is seared directly into the Psyker's mind. The process is described as agonizing beyond anything the human nervous system was designed to process. Imagine the psychic equivalent of staring into a star and having its light branded into your consciousness permanently. Survivors emerge changed in every measurable way, partially blinded from the experience, psychically scarred, but carrying a connection to the Emperor's power that makes them functional as astropaths or sanctioned Imperial Psykers. Many don't survive the binding at all. Their minds simply burn out during the process, consumed by contact with a psychic presence too vast for a normal human to contain. The rest, the weaker ones, the unstable ones, the ones who simply aren't powerful or resilient enough to justify the investment of soul binding, become fuel. Fed into the mechanisms that sustain the Astronomican and the Golden Throne, these Psykers burn out as psychic kindling. Their life force is expended to keep the beacon lit and the Emperor's ruined body cycling through another day of suspended decay. The commonly cited figure in the lore is roughly 1,000 Psykers consumed per day, though sources vary on whether that number is an exact count or an approximation of a continuous, fluctuating burn rate. Either way, the scale is real. Hundreds to thousands of human beings, every single day, psychically immolated to sustain a corpse on a machine that was never designed to hold him. The Black Ships have been running this circuit for 100 centuries. The institutions that manage the pipeline have millennia of operational practice. Entire bureaucracies exist solely to identify, collect, transport, sort, and process psychers for consumption. When someone asked on the last video whether this amounts to human farming, the answer, functionally, is yes. The Imperium operates a species-wide psychic tithe at galactic scale, feeding a god who isn't one with the lives of the people he claimed to be protecting. Every psyker who burns on Terra burns in the Emperor's name. The daily sacrifice is sanctified by 10,000 years of religious tradition, performed by institutions wrapped in incense and prayer, justified by a theology the Emperor would have called humanity's worst impulse, given organizational form and a budget. 10,000 years of this process have produced an Imperium that makes the Emperor's original vision look like a document from a different species. The Imperial truth is dead. Completely, totally, irreversibly dead. In its place stands the ecclesiarchy, a galaxy-spanning religious institution whose sole function is enforcing the worship of the Emperor as the one true God of humanity. Cathedrals fill the spaces where secular academies operated during the Great Crusade. Prayers have replaced empirical inquiry as the primary framework for understanding the universe. The Adeptus Mechanicus, the institution responsible for maintaining the Imperium's technology, treats machines as sacred objects, often embedding maintenance procedures in liturgical ritual rather than engineering methodology. They preserve and operate systems they only partially understand, and innovation is tightly constrained by religious orthodoxy. Asking how a device functions rather than simply chanting the correct activation rite is, in many Mechanicus forge temples, closer to heresy than curiosity. Citizens who question the Emperor's divinity face execution. Across every world the Imperium controls, the label heretic carries a death sentence enforced by the ecclesiarchy's own military arm, the Adepta Sororitas, and by the Inquisition. The Emperor's name is invoked in every prayer, every battle cry, every judicial proceeding, every governmental decision. Descriptions of the modern Imperium from within the setting's own framing capture it as a regime built on benevolence and cruelty, repression and stagnation, irrational superstition, and bureaucratic corruption. Everything the imperial truth was created to prevent hasn't just survived the doctrine's death. It's been codified into the operating philosophy of a million worlds, maintained by institutions that sincerely believe they are serving the Emperor's will while doing the precise opposite of what he demanded. The bureaucracy has calcified into a structure so dense and self-referential that administrative decisions require layers of religious approval from officials who answer to other officials who answer to a priesthood worshipping a god who explicitly told them to stop. Knowledge is hoarded rather than disseminated. Conformity is survival. Innovation is suspect. The institutions that once carried humanity's rationalist future have been consumed by theocratic structures so rigid that even mild reform reads as blasphemy. And we don't have to rely solely on external analysis to measure the transformation. The lore provides an in-universe witness who saw the gap between what the Emperor built and what the Imperium became. Roboute Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, one of the Emperor's loyal sons, the general who raised Monarchia on the Emperor's direct orders 10,000 years earlier, was resurrected in the 41st millennium after spending millennia in stasis. He woke up to an Imperium he could barely recognize. He walked through corridors hung with sacred banners. He watched officials conduct government through prayer instead of reason. He saw populations living in ignorance his father had spent centuries trying to eliminate. Guilliman's reaction, as presented in the later era novels, ranks among the most devastating passages in the setting. He reflects that the Imperium has become so saturated with worship that even an explicit denial of divinity from the Emperor himself would be treated as blasphemy. The religion had outgrown its God. The faith his father had burned cities to prevent had become so structurally embedded that not even the object of that faith could dismantle it. Guilliman's anguish, in essence, was the recognition that his father's life work had been inverted into its own negation, and that undoing the damage would require dismantling the only structure standing between humanity and extinction. He looked at everything the Imperium had become and wondered what they'd made of the dream he and his father had given everything for. The standard narrative of the Emperor's fall compresses into 3 beats. Chaos corrupted Horus. Horus wounded the Emperor went on the throne, and the Imperium slowly declined into its present state. Chaos is the villain. The Emperor is the victim. That version isn't wrong, but it lets the Imperium off the hook in a way the lore doesn't support. Chaos orchestrated Horus's corruption. Chaos fueled the civil war. The ruinous powers poured through the breach Magnus tore in the Webway. Without chaos, none of the heresy happens. But chaos didn't build the ecclesiarchy. Chaos didn't write the Lectitio Divinitatis. Lorgar composed that text while still loyal to the Emperor, before he'd had any contact with the Chaos gods. Chaos didn't institute the daily Psyker sacrifice as a sustained galactic infrastructure. Chaos didn't replace the Imperial truth with enforced superstition across 1,000,000 worlds. Chaos didn't take the Golden Throne, originally a Webway control mechanism, and transform it into a 10,000-year instrument of suffering sustained by burning human lives. Imperial servants did that. Administrators, priests, politicians, and ordinary humans, operating within the institutions the Emperor himself created, often believing sincerely that they were honoring his memory, turned trauma into dogma, and dogma into theocracy across 10,000 years of institutional drift. The Horus heresy shattered the Imperium's confidence. Half the legions betrayed them. The Emperor nearly died. In the aftermath, the survivors didn't rebuild toward the rationalist future he'd planned. They retreated into orthodoxy. Orthodoxy hardened into organized religion. Organized religion calcified into the exact civilization the Emperor had told them, explicitly and violently, never to build. There's a deeper vein of irony available, too, for anyone willing to examine the Emperor's own culpability. The Imperial truth itself may have accelerated the collapse it was designed to prevent. Khan's warning proved prophetic. In-universe voices described the Imperial truth as the Great Lie, a propaganda framework that denied the reality of the warp and left humanity with zero conceptual vocabulary for what chaos actually was. When the heresy ripped that denial apart, people who'd been told there were no gods suddenly discovered there were. And without any framework to process that revelation, without the education the Emperor chose not to provide, they reached the obvious conclusion. The Emperor, the most powerful being they'd ever encountered, must be one of those gods. The greatest one, the one worth worshipping. The Emperor's insistence on a lie, rather than a difficult truth, created the conceptual vacuum his own religion rushed to fill. Chaos struck the wound. The Imperium made it permanent. The Emperor's real prison isn't the Golden Throne. The throne is machinery, ancient, failing, but ultimately just a device. His prison is the religion. His prison is the civilization that took his name, his image, and his authority and used all three to construct the precise opposite of everything he believed. A rotting corpse on a machine of agony, worshipped as divine by the empire he built to end divinity, kept alive through the daily sacrifice of the people he existed to protect, surrounded by chanting, incense, and ritualized ignorance, everything he closed the last church on Terra to prevent, sanctified in his name by an institution his own rejected son founded. That's the Emperor of mankind in the 41st millennium. And what most summaries get wrong isn't the individual facts, the denial of godhood, the Golden Throne, the heresy. Those are stated accurately everywhere. What they miss is the structural weight. They mention that the Emperor denied being a god and move on, as if it's a footnote about his personality rather than the engine of the entire setting's tragedy. The denial is what makes the worship monstrous. The rationalism is what makes the theocracy unbearable. The love he rejected from Lorgar is what makes the religion personal rather than merely institutional. If you want to understand why the Imperium grinds on in its cruelty, its superstition, its stagnation, you can't just point at chaos and call it sufficient. You have to understand the sons who broke him. Horus, who swung the blade. Magnus, who shattered the escape route. Lorgar, who wrote the prayer book for the cage. 20 Primarchs, 20 experiments in genetic ambition, and each one failed the Emperor's design in its own specific, devastating way. Their full stories are next. Each is a different kind of catastrophe, and each explains a different piece of the wreckage the 41st millennium is built on. Subscribe if you want to hear them.